Hello, and welcome to MTG Another Look. These are cards that you should take another look at. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help the channel. Thank you. First up, let's talk about Afterlife Insurance. Afterlife Insurance is an Orzhov instant, 1 and a white-black hybrid mana, so 2 mana value. Creatures you control gain Afterlife 1 until end of turn, draw a card. It's from Ravnica Clue Edition. Because it's only been printed in a side product that doesn't seem to be too well received at this point, this spell is pretty easy to miss or scroll past. This card is a great spell to have in case of a board wipe. If you or an opponent plays a symmetrical board wipe, you can play Afterlife Insurance in response and make sure that you have a board of creatures when the dust settles. If you had only 4 creatures, no matter what they were, you'll end up with 4 1/1 flyers after. That means it's likely you will be the player first in turn order with creatures that can attack, barring some uncommon exceptions like opponents playing flash creatures. And the tokens that Afterlife Insurance makes are evasive, which means even if opponents are able to set up a defense when their turn comes around, you may be able to just fly over them for damage. However, if an opponent plays an asymmetrical board wipe, Afterlife Insurance also provides some unique benefits. Let's say an opponent casts a Plague Wind. That opponent is probably expecting the board to be completely clear of blockers, and may have been planning to attack you with their creatures. But if you played Afterlife Insurance, you can put a bunch of surprise blockers on the table. And the creatures are made before they decide who they want to attack, which can be very relevant. Commander players have a habit of attacking players who don't have any defenders. Even having a 1/1 chump blocker can sometimes cause a player to attack someone else. In the situation with the Plague Wind, your opponent would be faced with the choice of attacking into chump blockers and dealing no damage to you, or attacking a different opponent without blockers for player damage. Afterlife Insurance also shines way more than usual in aristocrat decks. Decks that plan to sacrifice a lot of creatures for a benefit and may already be making a lot of tokens to sacrifice will love this card. You can play Afterlife Insurance proactively on a big turn in which you want to sacrifice your board and set off Blood Artist triggers. Any creatures on the board when you play Afterlife Insurance will create another body when you sacrifice them. It will effectively double the number of triggers you get from your board. If you have 8 creatures in a Blood Artist, you get 8 triggers for sacrificing those creatures, and then 8 more for the spirit tokens also. The ability to interact with sacrifice and death triggers and things that trigger on creatures entering means there are plenty of situations where Afterlife Insurance is better than using other common spells like Flawless Maneuver to just protect your original creatures from a board wipe. Notice also that Afterlife Insurance does not say non-token creatures you control get Afterlife 1. That means even your token creatures will gain Afterlife until end of turn, and when they die will create a spirit to replace them. So for aristocrat decks, or even go-wide token decks that just plan on using doubling effects like Anointed Procession, Afterlife Insurance will give you twice as much value as usual. It's important to point out that only the creatures on your battlefield when you play Afterlife Insurance will get Afterlife 1. I think this is something that's easy for new players to misread or interpret incorrectly. This will not help you make an infinite combo by sacrificing the spirits made by Afterlife Insurance. Those tokens do not have Afterlife, and once they die, they just die. Any other creatures that enter the battlefield after the spell resolves will not have Afterlife either. All this protection and value that Afterlife Insurance provides would be amazing on its own, but they even tacked a free card draw onto the spell for a little bonus. Afterlife Insurance goes great in Teysa Karlov, Elisil Kor, Sadistic Pilgrim, or Thalis, Reverent Medium. Secondly, we have Delayed Blast Fireball. It's 1 and 2 red for an instant. Delayed Blast Fireball deals 2 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. If this spell was cast from exile, it deals 5 damage to each opponent and each creature they control instead. And then it has Foretell with a Foretell cost of 4 and 2 red. I think a lot of people are familiar with Delayed Blast Fireball and like it, but I still think it's underrated. I see it played in Exile Matters decks, where you can Impulse draw it off the top of your deck and cast it for 3 mana, but still get to do 5 damage to your opponents and their creatures. It's an auto-include in those style of decks. You get the best of both worlds, the cheaper cost and higher damage. But I would go as far as saying Delayed Blast Fireball is good enough to be a correct inclusion in most casual red decks. If you're in a control deck, instant speed sweepers are still in short supply. You're going to want to keep the board clear, and the problem with symmetrical and sorcery speed board wipes is that your opponents often will have a chance to rebuild faster than you. With Delayed Blast Fireball being instant speed, you can sweep up all the small and medium-sized creatures and keep yourself safe for a turn cycle or two. It's also an asymmetrical board wipe that your creatures will never die from. That means if you're playing a mid-range creature deck, not necessarily one that wants to control the board, it's a good include here too. Clearing the way for your creatures to attack your opponent, sometimes for the win, is a great way to use this card as well, and the 5 damage will help your aggressive strategies by depleting an eighth of each opponent's life total. Let me say this up front, this card is not as good as Cyclonic Rift. Now, that being said, this card is similar to Cyclonic Rift in a few ways, worse in each, but still similar. Both cards have a small option to get a weaker effect for 2 or 3 mana, and a larger kicked effect at 7 or 8 mana. Both are instants, and both only affect your opponents. They also can both be used effectively to wipe away most or all of your opponent's defenses and leave them open for your Alpha Strike. 8 mana seems like a lot, and it is, even if it's split up over multiple turns, but contrasting its ability to be a game-winning play with something like Cyclonic Rift makes the usually 6 mana you need to set it off seem very worth it. Delayed Blast Fireball also has the benefit of stacking well when you copy it. Copying 1 means 10 damage to each opponent and each creature they control. That's a massive chunk of a player's starting life total. Even copying the small version for 4 damage is pretty reasonable for only 3 mana. The same goes for damage doublers. Any synergy with the damage makes the rate to cast it amazing. I honestly think that with the modality and flexibility of the card, and the ubiquitous ways of cheating the cost with Impulse Draw, Delayed Blast Fireball should be a staple in the Commander format. I like to play it in most 1 to 3 color decks because it's just that good. I realize that the price of the card has gone up a lot since its release, and that is disappointing. I really hope they reprint it, preferably in Commander Precons, to get the price down to a much more affordable point. If you have a copy or can access one but have been iffy about including it in your decks, try it out. It's less clunky than it may seem. Delayed Blast Fireball goes great in Judith, Carnage Connoisseur, Solfim, Mayhem Dominus, or Calamax the Stormsire. Third, let's talk about On the Trail. This is a card I made a short about, but I have a few more things to say about it. On the Trail is an enchantment for 1 and a green mana. Whenever you draw your second card each turn, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. So this card has the ability to ramp you a whole lot. All you have to do is draw 2 cards to get the trigger, and you get to put a tap land into play from your hand. This is going to be exceptionally easy on your own turn. You can play sorcery speed draws. If you're playing a turbo deck with cards like Howling Mine in your deck, or have a commander that draws you cards like Kaneos and Tiro and Meletis, you're going to be triggering On the Trail's effect pretty regularly. Even in mono green, it'll be pretty easy to trigger the effect on your turn with the typical draw that you should be playing anyway, like Toski, Bearer of Secrets, or even Beast Whisperer. Ramping for no extra mana on each of your turns for drawing cards, something you plan on doing and want to be doing already, is very good. In decks that draw a lot of cards regularly, that's enough of a reason to include it. Now let's talk about Enchantress decks. Enchantress decks are notorious for being able to draw tons of cards that snowball to the point of not being able to cast everything you draw. Many Enchantress decks will play 3 or 4 spells in one turn, draw 9 or 12 cards from casting enchantments, and then end their turn with around 15 cards and have to discard down a hand size. Drawing that many cards is great, but being unable to cast everything fast enough will put a crimp in your gameplay. Composer of Spring from the Commander Masters Precons provided a new and very much needed effect for Enchantress decks. It allowed you to ramp with each enchantment you cast or create, and gives the Enchantress archetype a real explosive potential, but it's only 1 card. Enchantresses are a dime a dozen nowadays, but Composer of Spring is one of a kind. You should definitely add the Composer to your Enchantress decks when making lists right after the Enchantresses, and we haven't gotten to anything nearly as useful for the archetype until now. On the Trail can fill the role of your second copy of Enchantress Ramp. It's not going to ramp you nearly as much as the Composer, but a free land ramp on each of your turns is still something these decks are going to want. It even triggers your other constellation effects because it's an enchantment. On the Trail can ramp more than once a turn cycle if you can activate it on your opponent's turns. And that's easier to do than you might think. Having a Consecrated Sphinx on the battlefield will trigger the enchantment on each of your opponent's turns automatically. Putting a Wedding Ring on an opponent can help you trigger it on off turns. Even playing typical instant speed draw spells will trigger the effect. Of course, Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, and Trouble in Pairs can draw absurd amounts on off turns and ramp you continually. This card is a perfect fit in Zimone and Dina decks. It already will have the theme of wanting to draw 2 cards a turn. On the Trail can help you build up to the 8 land threshold for Zimone and Dina's sack ability, and once there, that ability can trigger the enchantment on opponent's turns by itself. It's like On the Trail was made for this deck. Commanders I would pair with On the Trail include Tatiova, Benthic Druid, Jolrael, Mwanvuli Recluse, or Kaidel, Chosen of Krufix. Next up is Courageous Resolve. It's an instant for 2 and a white. Up to 1 target creature you control gains protection from each of your opponents until end of turn. Draw a card. It also has Fateful Hour and says if you have 5 or less life, you can't lose life this turn, you can't lose the game this turn, and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Mainly, I think this card is good for the first ability. The Fateful Hour text isn't going to be relevant most of the time, if at all for you. But the first effect more than makes up for that. First of all, it's an instant. It can be in your Sunforger deck. And your Sunforger deck may just synergize well with it by its strategy being Voltron adjacent. Courageous Resolve is going to shine exceptionally well in your Voltron decks. If you're trying to finish off opponents with 1 creature, this creature is going to turn into a triple True Name Nemesis until on a turn. It'll be unblockable, can't be damaged by your opponent's creatures when blocking, and can't be targeted by any spell they play. Any blasphemous act will have the damage prevented. You can play it in response to a damage-based board wipe or a removal spell to protect your creature, and it even draws you a card. If you're playing an equipment deck, you can suit up 1 creature and cast a Resolve to make it unblockable and untargetable to swing in for the kill. If you're playing Nasty Narset, you can make your opponent's groan even harder by flipping the Resolve off the top and making her unblockable and safe from damage until end of turn, even if you have multiple combat steps. Even if you're not playing Voltron, it can save your commander or a choice creature, or make it break through board stalls, and it won't even put you down a card with a cantrip. The second ability is not reliable unless you're playing some kind of life swap deck, but the ability is useful for stopping combo decks from winning. There isn't a lot of interaction in non-blue colors to interrupt combo decks, but having the ability to Angel's Grace yourself if the stars align, and you have the right life total, is a little bonus, even if it won't come up often. Preventing a Thassa's Oracle win with this would probably feel pretty good. And the fact that you have that effect stapled on a card that you're playing for a different reason means you're not including dead cards in your deck lists. Courageous Resolve would go well in Narset Enlightened Exile, Kellen the Fey-Blooded, or Rafika the Many. Next, we're going to talk about Realmbreaker the Invasion Tree. It's an artifact for 3 mana. It has pay 2 and tap, target opponent mills 3 cards. Put a land card from their graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under your control. It gains if this land would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. It also has pay 10, tap, sack, search your library for any number of Praetor cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle. If you're not playing green or white in a medium speed pod or in a control deck, this card might be useful for you. Land ramp is the most resilient form of ramp, and it is unfortunately mostly locked in only those 2 colors. In a slower deck that wants to win with a lot of mana, or one that can reasonably lock down and defend itself, Realmbreaker is a decent option for repeatable ramp. 5 mana is kind of a lot for 1 land, but it's sorta comparable to other colorless options. People pay 4 mana for 1 land with Solemn Simulacrum, and 6 for 2 with Burnished Heart. So 5 for 1 with the ability to do it again every turn cycle isn't out of the question. In some decks, it may be in your best interest to play it alongside these cards. The other option for non-white and green decks to ramp is Mana Rocks. They're the most commonly used option, and in very fast, high-power pods, they're the correct option. If you're trying to win as quickly as possible, you don't want to be wasting time paying 1 or 2 more mana here and there for resiliency when your opponents are rushing to finish you off. But that's not the case in every playgroup. Sometimes even decks that are trying to win quickly get stuck in situations where they can't and have to switch to a longer term plan. Commander players are really fond of Vandal Blast, and I think it's grown in popularity since treasures became ubiquitous. Vandal Blast and other popular sweepers that wipe out artifacts are popular because they destroy mana rocks as well. 3 for 1ing each opponent is a reasonable amount of card advantage, and a lot of people that are comfortable depending on mana rocks can get set back turns or even become mana screwed because their ramp wasn't diverse enough. I think in certain situations it's correct to play Mana Rocks, and other decks synergize better with Mana Dorks, and there are definitely situations where cards like Realm Breaker are going to be the correct play. The strategy of not being the threat at the table has become more popular over time as well, trying to utilize second move advantage to save your resources and then strike when your opponents are more spent. Realm Breaker can help with that strategy or take advantage of opponents with that playstyle. Sitting back with your artifact and paying 2 mana to essentially rampant growth off the top of an opponent's deck can slowly build you resources while other people attack or remove each other's threats. There are some players that don't like having the cards stolen in-game or don't like other people touching their cards. It may be a good idea to keep some kind of tokens you can ride on in those situations. There are dry erase tokens or even cheap index cards can be used in place of opponents' lands in-game if necessary. We've been evaluating Realm Breaker as if it just creates lands that tap for colorless mana, and sometimes when you steal off-color lands, that's essentially what you'll have. And I think it's a reasonable option in that case. But sometimes you'll get lucky and get a powerful utility land off an opponent's deck or out of their graveyard. Milling a Field of the Dead or targeting a Vesuva that's already in the graveyard can give you extra advantage. And if you happen to be playing Praetors in your deck already, or you build a Praetor deck, you have the option to tooth and nail them into play in the late game. I have Realm Breaker in a Jin Gitaxias deck. It can go well in Arvinox, the Mind Flail, or even Phoenix, God of Deception. I want to say thank you to everyone that joined me today to discuss some cool commander deck options. What do you think of these cards? Are they worth a shot in one of your decks? Let me know in the comments and join me next time to take another look. Have a great day.